effects, leaving out other violations and focusing on individuals, and thus failing to account for structural violence, the roots of the problem. Now, I learned a great deal from your analysis here. My question concerned thinking about the source of the problem. So, what's at the source? Now, in particular, what's at the source of some of the difficulties that the PTRC had? Was the source of the problem that particularly it was just simply they focused so much on rape as a form of sexual violence? That seemed to be one answer suggested, because it was just so much that was left out just by focusing on rape, and that seemed to position women in that subject position of victim and harmed victims. It seems then that one thing would be to then suggest not having that focus at rape, but then that seems very difficult because rape, particularly in these contexts of mass violence, is something that is seen as not just an individual harm, but also as something that is attacks at the social fabric and is part of the goal of national rebuilding. So my concern is, well, perhaps maybe to think about, should we shift the focus, particularly during these sensitive times where we're trying to deal with national rebuilding? I've worked with, I'm trained as a political theorist, and one of the things that I've worked with my book is stories of rape as foundational stories. And rape seems to be the quintessential act of the establishment of a patriarchal society, and it seems that if that's the case, then maybe begin there as a way of contesting it, and perhaps maybe retaining the focus speaks to, but decolonizing it, as you suggest, speaks to more tackling the way in which women and women's bodies, and particularly indigenous women's bodies in Latin America, as we've known from the colony, have been the fodder upon which patriarchal societies have been created, literally, the synthesis of, the race, the creation of the nation, all based on these stories from, La Dolorosa in Mexico to everywhere. It's always on the basis of sort of this originary rape. So there's perhaps maybe beyond just the legal focus, symbolic reasons to focus on this that maybe can be deployed. The other question I had is in relation to thinking about sexual violence and rape is, since I am not as well versed in the subject, is why wasn't it also discussed as not just in terms of the binary of victim-perpetrator, but rather in more collective terms, particularly with regards to not both harms to society at large, but also to indigenous communities. Was this something that the legalistic approach and focusing on just the victim as the subject of this foreclosed, so we wouldn't be able to deal with that? And I mentioned that I focus on the collective because indeed this reflects a lot of emerging indigenous rights at the international level that have increasingly enshrined ideas about collective rights and dealing with harms on collective terms. And at the time, Peru, by I believe 1995, had already signed the ILO Convention 169. So although 169 doesn't particularly talk about rape, it still provides an article of injunction against violence upon indigenous subjects, defining their status as peoples. So harm, the entity of harm being a collectivity, and injunctions against force and coercion against them in collective terms. So I'm just wondering if there was any discussion of collective rights and thinking about some of these harms, particularly because that would, and if there's attempts to decolonize it, that would be one way of further decolonizing the law, is in thinking about another beyond the liberal, individualistic, legal approach of individuals as the sole receptors of rights, but rather thinking of collectivities as the agents of rights. Now, related to these issues concerning the production of victimhood, let me make sure I'm sticking with my... Okay. Which I think it's important to think about the construction of subjects as victimhood. I think the discussion on the public hearings was very illuminating that you discussed in the book, and two issues stood out for me. One is, as you discuss, and I wanted to have you talk more about, is the linking of victimhood to certain gender stereotypes like maternal stereotypes or motherhood, which, as you discussed, left out the role of women who were categorized as subversives. Now, in your analysis, you rightly note that there was a shadow role of women combatants that was obscured by this particular focus. They were the only permissible victims in their definition of victimhood was non-combatants. And once women stepped into the role of subversives, they were left this fear, all of a sudden, of victims to whom crimes could be committed against, and now crimes were allowed to be committed with impunity against them. And this was sidelined. Now, your analysis gives us this focus on being able to think more about this other side of who's left out and how they can be, these crimes can be rendered now not crimes anymore, and certain subjects no longer the purview of being harmed, which I think is very dangerous. And it seems that if national rebuilding and reconciliation is to remain a goal of truth and reconciliation commissions, this is really troubling, but also I think incorporating it seems paradoxical, because TRCs are happening under the onus of a new state in transition, and the emphasis is on state. And to serve not only societal recognition, but also state rebuilding, the focus being on state rebuilding. Now, it serves to re-legitimate the state. Yet, the internal conflict in Peru and its violence spoke to not just an act by Sendero Luminoso to act and then all of a sudden set this conflict into it, but long-standing legitimation crisis, I would argue, even before Sendero Luminoso, one which made it permissible, like Sendero Luminoso, to gain ground. Otherwise, they wouldn't have gained ground. Without the deep class and geographical divides, the lack of state representativity of vast popular sectors, and the resentment and alienation it produced, the conflict would not have arisen. The acts of violence perpetrated against the population, of course, we know it's not only by Sendero Luminoso, but by the state themselves. Military forces are not independent, they're functions of the state. So does the Truth Commission, being a tool for state rebuilding or refounding, foreclose its ability to develop more robust accounts of violence like we wanted to, but more robust in their application not only to past actors, but present ones and enduring state institutions that remain, like military structures? So is it something that if we want to decolonize, it might be better to approach it from the Dems perspective rather than to think about involving the state? It might be that's something that it can't, but it seems to me that we can't sidestep it. Because if we want a more robust account of the violence and responsibility and accountability, the state has to be also up on trial. Now, does the status, if we wanted to have, if we focus on the status dimension, does it impact the possibilities for decolonizing transitional justice? That is, decolonizing has to operate outside of thinking about the function of TCRCs as state rebuilding. So that's one question. To what extent what's the Peru case showing us about that, about thinking about this? Can it be decoupled from these state functions, or is it decolonizing transitional justice something that has to happen beyond the state? So it would appear that if we were to view the violence in a way that situated the state more centrally, not simply as a target for reconciliation, but itself the problem, it's going to serve decolonizing efforts. It might try rethinking what we think of as a victimhood as the appropriate subject for reconciliation by complicating the notion of actors within episodes of mass violence strictly as victims and passive, and individual targets of acts of violence, particularly by individuals and not the state. So with that said, let me reconsider, as I'm finalizing things, to this framing of victimhood. I think it's right that it's limiting, and there are concerns for considering it. These cases are not just concerning transitional justice, but rather seeking justice for indigenous groups for violence against their cultures, lands, and capacities to exist as a people. So in the cases that I've been working on, it's been mostly focused on extractivist activities by companies such as petroleum multinationals on their land. And one thing that's worried me is the framing of victim, for instance, in if you're trying to seek justice for an oil spill as a way of holding accountable, like a petroleum company. It seems to reproduce indigenous subjects as passive and strictly their bodies as sites of harm by focusing on the only way you can get anything is if you're a victim, and this being the category for representation. But my question is also, though, as I've been thinking about victims and victimhood and its problems, is do the subject effects necessarily have to be disempowering? That's a tricky question. And by that I mean that the category of victim, we can think of it as a category of analysis and representation, so how people are represented before the law. But it's also, you can think about it in terms of how it's used as a category, both strategically, people understanding and not believing their victims, and instead for self-representation purposes, as well as how it figured in the one case that you talked about in the TCRC, this testimony of this woman, Georgina Gamboa Garcia, who gave testimony of her rape, accompanied by her 20-year-old daughter, who was the product of that rape. Now, she understood herself as victimized, but it wasn't in a passive way. Her sense of victimization, because she was angry. And anger seemed to me a really important emotion to bring out as a contrast to pity, which seemed to be the focus of what was happening in the hearings. Now, in her book, Sing the Rage, Listening to Anger After Mass Violence, Sonali Chakravarti makes a case for taking anger seriously. Rather than dismissing as this anarchic train of emotions that is a danger to reconciliation, she suggests that anger is critical to achieving the goals of reconciliation for truth commissions. For one thing, it permits us to have further insights into what citizens fear and what they need to restore trust in political institutions and in each other. It's hence something not simply at the edge of politics, but of great political value itself. Now, adopting Chakravarti's argument, I want to suggest that maybe some value for the subject position of victim when we redefine it, not necessarily in a limited or passive sense, but as the angry victim. And this may have some value for the decolonizing project, particularly as it relates to indigenous people. This would also stand as a nice contrast to, as I mentioned, pity, because when that was the public reception to the hearings, it rendered the rest of the public, the urban educated elites, able to disavow any sense of responsibility for what's happening. It's harder to disavow when there's somebody angry in your face. It sort of provokes more of a consciousness about responsibility. So if the goal of TCRCs is the transformation of social norms, I think maybe perhaps thinking about anger, certainly pity played out, but I was wondering questions like, why was those more angry episodes curtailed, or were they curtailed? In your interviews, did you encounter more of these angry victims, and how, and why wasn't this given more, more of an emphasis if there were more prevalence of this? I think you have suggested one answer in the angry, the way in which Sendero Luminoso thought of or used the anger of women. So maybe that's one reason why I was limited. But I also think anger is an important thing to think about for reconciliation. And let me conclude here before we run out of time with the last comments I want to make about social transformation, is that despite the work of the TTRC and its attempts to transform racism and discrimination and think about violence against indigenous people, it remains prominent, as we know. And this includes the role of state as perpetrators of that violence. And these attitudes, for instance, at the state level, were most infamously reflected in President Alan Garcia's Dog in the Manger doctrine in 2007, which compared indigenous to dogs as a way of delegitimizing their resistance against measures where they were trying to restrict incursions against their lands. And in 2009, this erupted into violence against the Awajun and Wampis indigenous people who called a general strike against these orders. Now, once again, these indigenous protesters were labeled by the government insurgents, so we get the return of this language, and old colonial stereotypes to justify, once again, violence against them, equating them to dogs, calling them uncivilized and barbarous. And 7 years after what many have called this Bagua massacre, there's been no justice for victims. Revealing this continued state of impunity and lack of state recognition of indigenous populations and their rights. Now, it seems that one of the things that this angry victim now is once again called this insurgent, but perhaps, and if not now, we can't return to that, it might have been a missed opportunity for the PTRC, because at that point, maybe it was a moment that was more prone to openness. And these acts of defiance that could be maybe more, or these modes of defiance that could be more tolerated. But the last thing I want to touch on is the issues of language and time, and that's where I'll end, because this, in your discussion, was very prominent, the way in which the majority of victims were Quechua speakers, but the way in which there was such a rampant inattention to linguistic issues. And one of the ways that you looked at it was through temporality, so through time. It's time afforded, time allowed, and the sense that the time was very linear. There's sort of like, we want to attain this break with the past, and this past of violence and this present of peace. So you juxtaposed against that, perhaps thinking about time in a different way as maybe cyclical, and that certainly has reverberations with indigenous cosmologies. But one thing I thought is in decolonizing away from linear senses of times, do we need then to give up the sense that we can make a new beginning? That is, that things can change, that it's not just going to be the eternal return of the same old things coming over and over and over. And then last but not least, one of the things that seems so fruitful that I wish you could maybe elaborate on is the notion of interculturality as a tool for maybe continuing decolonizing beyond the state through maybe more dialogue. You mentioned in the book that Demos talked about and used the notion of interculturality, but I was wondering if there had been any more work done with thinking about the role of interculturality in transitional processes, or was this something that had just been colonized entirely by its use by the state in bilingual education? That is it something that activists were still trying to work with? To think about maybe transforming some of these societal attitudes about who can be harmed more and who is a colonized subject and should remain so. So with that said, I'll open it up to discussion, and thank you for your great talk and book.
My suggestion procedurally is that you go back up and take a few more questions and then address whatever you wish if everyone gives your comments and whatever you want to do. Okay?
Thank you, Angelica, for such breadth and depth of comments. I hope that you'll share your comments with me so that I can reflect more deeply on them. Are there any other questions that I could entertain? Don't be shy. I'll give you a minute.
I won't be shy then. I wonder if you could perhaps tell us a little bit more about the broad context of the Peruvian Truth and Reconciliation Commission. It came sort of towards the end of many other Truth Commission experiences, Salvador, Argentina, Guatemala, and also South Africa, so it could learn from. It also struck me in my limited understanding as very much a national truth commission as opposed to one that was managed or run by the United Nations as they were in Central America, but also one that received a lot of advice from international actors like International Center for Transitional Justice in New York, which worked with them extensively on building their model. And so I just wonder the degree to which the Truth Commission's understanding of gender and sexual violence issues was informed by its place historically, by those kinds of international interactions, which may be a good thing or may not be. I mean, it could be that the generally positive view that outsiders have of the Commission as a result of its national ownership.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I mean, I feel that you actually laid out a lot of the context, so I'll sort of add into that Peru came after a whole slew and was parallel with, I could look it up exactly, but I want to say Haiti and East Timor time frame. I could, and at the tail end of South Africa. Right? So it was drawing, at least when it comes to thinking about, and then of course you have the international tribunals that I mentioned. So it was at a point where these issues of gender and sexual violence had already started to circulate, and they knew that that was going on, and they had to kind of work with that somehow, right? And in terms of sexual violence, one of the pieces that was very significant was the Guatemala case. That was really, really key in terms of coming to understand sexual violence and how it's played out with indigenous communities, and that informed framing sexual violence. And in terms of gender analysis, that was floating, right? And also a lot of UN sort of declarations and so forth that that brought that, and there was a lot of also international pressure and then domestic pressure to try to belatedly add that gender unit. And of course with South Africa, there was the deep inspiration around the public hearings. And in all of these cases, like you said, bringing in, thank you so much, bringing in people who had been central to these different processes to inform the commissioners about how they had taken their, more practical steps. Like, well, how do you construct your research design, and how do you sort of balance between historical truth and trying to really document the exact human rights violations and all of these processes. I'm sure there's much more to be said. Let me think about it for a second. I think one of the key pieces I would like to sort of put emphasis on are the public hearings and how important the South Africa experience was for Peru to incorporate public hearings at all to begin with, which was not necessarily something that had been taking place in the Latin American context, and then also the focus on women's hearings. And reflecting very deeply on the structure of the South Africa hearings. And interestingly, the people who are in charge of the public hearings in Peru drew in long-term veteran activists and people who worked also in cultural production. Angelica mentioned the Grupo Cultural Yuyachkani, to think about how do we construct a space in which we can create a collective narration of what happened to be the basis of constructing a national narrative. So the South African Truth and Reconciliation, or the public hearings, had the testimony givers and the commissioners facing each other and at different levels. Right, so they really thought through how did they want to do it, and what they did was they had like a table that's a semicircular table constructed in which everyone sat at it, right? And so the idea was to create a horizontality and create a space that would sort of be clean and new, like, cover up everything so the space would be one where people come to sit at the same table to share the narrative. So the South Africa public hearing was really critical in thinking about, for the Peruvian case, how to construct that. It's just like kind of a deeper story there. There's so much that I want to respond to you, but then also there may be that one I can't connect in my mind to something that you said, so I'll just see if there's another question. Yeah.
So, really interesting talk. I'm wondering if you could say a little bit more about the conflict that you mentioned in thinking about the colonial discourses and Quijano's works that this feminist group, Demos, in their self-reflection, dealt with about, on the one hand, thinking of colonial processes as creating hierarchy and control, national patriarchies and so forth, so the negative parts of the colonial modern discourse. And then on the other hand, the positive ideas of progress and individual rights and emancipation and so forth. And as feminists, how do they negotiate wanting to retain something of the modern notion of individual rights and women's rights and blah, 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 that discourse when they're dealing with indigenous women with whom that discourse is not, doesn't connect to their own culture. So how did they think about, weeding through this, the whole complicated discourse of modernity to, come up with some practical solutions of bridging the gap, the incommensurable gap between the cultures.
This is an area where feminists in general, I'd say, but in Peru, have not been very successful. And clearly saying, okay, well, that was a case of sexual violence and we have to, look at the individuality of it and get it prosecuted and move on. Like, don't tell me about this other, maybe, other logics through which to interpret it. This has been a very, very difficult sort of what you might even call feminist imperialist kind of mindset, right? And what I thought although obviously the Demos case is very problematic, they are the only group that I could see that was deeply engaging that problem and really trying to think through how could you have multiple logics occurring at once and follow them and hold them together, although they may seem completely incoherent, right? Like, how can you have this sort of one goal, which is like under sort of the liberal sort of justice rubric, right, of prosecuting these cases, and at the same time, in somewhat maybe parallel fashion, engage the ways in which these women and the community may be thinking about these issues, and validating that, and following that through, and then holding them all together and having a conversation about how all these things don't work out. Period. They don't work out, right? You can't bridge them, right? But then if you're having a conversation with, for example, these three women about these issues, then they're making their choices among these different sort of incoherent logics themselves, versus the feminist NGO entity coming in, dropping in, and doing their savior game. So there's a huge conversation to be had within that, right? And I've had many sort of very volatile discussions with Peruvian feminists who are who aren't willing to think this through. One example is the idea that when you have a child due to rape, that you want that the rapist to give you money to be able to provide for that child, right? And that they should marry. Like, the solution is get married, because then that person who perpetrated this crime will have to provide for that child. And that, that could be a community, that is a, common community-based solution. And Jelike Bozen writes about this extensively. Now, clearly, from the liberal feminist perspective, you're going to say that is just not acceptable, right? And clearly, many of us are revolted by that, right? Well, follow me on this for a second.
Liberal or not, from any feminist perspective, not just from me.
Right, but what I want to do is lay out the other logic that could be going on that I'm not trying to justify, but I want to lay it out, because it's about holding these pieces together, although they are seemingly, completely oppositional. So on a community level, if you're thinking about community sustainability, you need someone to provide for that child. Who's going to provide for that child? That child is going to have very low nutrition. Who's going to pay for that child's utilidades, or to get to school, to have a pencil? Who's going to pay for that? What is going to happen? The fabric of the community becomes extremely stretched, because how are the relatives going to try to cover that cost? Now, clearly, there's a deeply violent and patriarchal logic to all of this, right? But at the same time, the goal is basically what you could also call an economic reparation. Get money to be sure that child can survive, So this is the messiness. How do you manage and hold all this together if through the law, marriage and the institution of marriage is what's going to allow you the economic reparation? This is just one example of how difficult that is, right? Yeah.
So I just wanted to build off of Richard's question.
Yeah.
In terms of sexual violence, so Luisa Mantilla, who obviously was pretty much the unit. because of her fighting the TRC to get it on the agenda.
Literally.
Which is due to one individual pushing this work. And so just to share an anecdote within my own research in Peru, I had a brilliant law student who was interning with me and very fascinated with the forced sterilization issue.
Mm-hmm.
And we had an interview with Salman Lerner, who was the head of the TRC, and she was sitting there and she had her moment to ask a question, and she said, well, why are you not looking at forced sterilization? And he said, well, it wasn't in our mandate.
Exactly,
And she
that's the
said, well,
answer.
yes, it was. And he said, no, it wasn't. And he literally climbed up his bookcase, pulled out the book, and I have the mandate, which is assassinations and kidnapping, forced disappearance, torture and other serious injuries, violations to collective rights of Andean and Native communities in the country, and then finally, E, other crimes and serious violations against the rights of people. And he literally turned white.
Wow.
It was just not even realizing, or the lack of someone in that institution to push that issue. Jaleesa, for whatever reason, maybe decided it was too much to take on. But it's not just the external pressure, it's internally who even knows to have this be an issue and how to frame it and have the ability to get a largely male institution to pay attention to this issue. So
I have
just
more
to
on that
share.
backstory.
Okay.
So this is what happened, just so people might not know about the forced sterilizations. Under Alberto Fujimori's regime in Peru in the 1990s, in the mid-1990s, he supported a public health policy and campaign that included family planning and sterilization as a, obviously you're supposed to choose that, right? Now what happened is that there was basically a hidden sort of quotas and financial support given to doctors that would sterilize women, particularly in the Andes and the Amazon. So many women were forcibly sterilized. For example, coming into a clinic to give birth, and they would not be attended until they signed some form, and that form was their consent to being sterilized. And they didn't even know that happened. And many women were sterilized, many women died from complications from very unhygienic environments in which this happened, no follow-up, infections, and so forth and so on. Hundreds and hundreds of women. Now, that happened, and then there's a whole nother debate around how feminists dealt with that. And I won't get into, but there was a report that was put out called Nada Personal from the group GLADEM, and that got that issue on the table, and then it was starting to kind of gain a little bit of steam. And there were so few people, Julissa Mantilla and just a handful of other feminists who were trying to push the gender sort of analysis and gender agenda within the PTRC, and the issue that had no attention was sexual violence during internal armed conflict. So it was an issue of, okay, where do we place our energies? And there was an effort to get this onto the table because it does fit into the broader definition of sexual violence, forced sterilization. But this is sort of like that E, which is vague. So then you have to make the link to sexual violence fitting under E, and then you have to make the link to forced sterilization fitting under sexual violence, and it's an incredibly long sort of linking that needs to be, enormously reinforced to be able to get to the point of including forced sterilizations. The argument was that this crime was not committed, it's not related to the armed conflict, although it was related to the Fujimori regime, which was being which was part of the whole outcome of the authoritarian regime, right? So it could have been included, but there wasn't the kind of energy and resources and capacity to include it and force it in, and the energy was put to try to just at least get these two cases, the Manta Vilca case in, and then another case that was typical of emblematic of the way that sexual violence happened in urban context in police installations.
It could also suggest genocide, which was not discussed in Peru.
Okay, so there's like all these layers. Okay, well, I guess I will leave it there.
Hey, well, yeah, sure. I mean, you can say something else.
Okay. I wanted to
Just
just.
to stop immediately.
Well, you. I know how the dynamic, like 15 years later. Okay, sure, Sonia. Which way do I go? What I did want to clarify, just because it wasn't something that I talked about in the book very much, was that the PTRC did have these community investigations where they focused on the whole community, and they would choose specific communities and like really look at everything that happened within them. And this is an area that, in terms of Angelica's commentary, I did want to highlight that they did do those. Now, in terms of the Andes, again, I want to highlight that typically people do not identify through indigeneity. So this becomes a very sort of touchy and difficult negotiation. And I did not look in closely into the Amazonian cases, but because in the Amazon people do identify through indigeneity, I think that is a place where a lot of the connection would be made with your line of questioning, is through the Amazonian cases. And the other thing I wanted to say too is in terms of collective investigations, another legal framework which I thought was fascinating that I mentioned, APRODE, who's doing forwarding some cases right now that are going on, is that they also have this strategy, which I only know in Spanish, which is caso patron. I don't know, Lisa, can you help me with the legal English version of caso patron, where you look at a specific time frame in a specific community. Emblematic legal case? Okay. And like, 85 to 91. I mean, it's kind of long. I mean, it could also be like 91 only, right? There's, depending on the case. Everything, all the basket of human rights violations that happened during that time frame in that community, and that is the case, right? So that includes any number of things and sexual violence, right? And that's another way of kind of getting at the collective aspect of getting out of the individualized sort of judicial process. So those are two things I wanted to mention there. And I also just, there's so many more things I could say, but I just wanted to say in closing, I really appreciate that you mentioned El Grupo Cultural Yuyachkani, and the image there is of Rosa Cuchillo's One Woman popular theater presentation. And just to sort of give another way in terms of transitional justice, clearly, the state is so limited, right? And so I think it is so useful to think about how, for example, El Grupo Cultural Yuyachkani, who's been doing what we might call social reconciliation for 40 plus years, right? That somehow during this so-called transitional justice process gets sort of attached on, like it's a side product that helps the state initiative. I think it's very helpful, for example, to think about them doing this incredibly important work, political and social work, over a long period of time with these goals that we may call now justice, truth, and reconciliation. And the Peruvian Truth and Reconciliation Commission sort of kind of being a teeny piece that they kind of affiliated with over those couple years. So kind of shifting the gaze to think about how many other actors have this same agenda who've been pursuing it for decades, and that maybe we need to sort of shift our focus and open our optic to how these kinds of goals are met. So it's a little broadening there. Okay, thank you.
Coffee in the back, and we can take a brief break, 15 minutes or so, and then we'll resume for our second panel, and hopefully you will all join us for that.